today about the role that philanthropy can play in our family's well-being, because we know that particularly at this juncture in history, that there are very real threats to our families, not just our Native families, all families. Native families are in there, and Native families specifically, we are both a race of people, but we're a political class. And so Native children and Native families, the federal government has a treaty and trust obligation to take care of our families. We know this through the Indian Child Welfare Act. We know this through our tribes and what our tribes are doing around family preservation. We know that there are urban Indian organizations throughout the country that are doing phenomenal work around child welfare. But before we get started on the panel itself, I'm going to turn it over to David Simmons, who works for the National Indian Child Welfare Association, to really ground us in what the Indian Child Welfare Act is and why it's important.
Great, thank you, Janine. Now, I think it's always important to kind of think about sort of how did we get here? And with the Indian Child Welfare Act, it started many generations ago. Kind of in the late 1960s, there were grandparents, aunties, uncles, tribal leaders around the country asking similar questions about where are our children going. Many of these are people who themselves had survived the boarding school era and were hoping for a better day for their children, for their communities. But what they discovered individually and then more collectively is that there were children, Native children, being removed across the country from their individual tribal communities and placed in state foster care systems, oftentimes being adopted out, and oftentimes to non-Native families. Now, these proceedings were happening without the involvement of the children's tribal governments or any of their relatives, and this led to the Association on American Indian Affairs conducting a study starting in the late 1960s, where they documented that approximately 25 to 35% of all Native children across the country were in some out-of-home care placed there by a state or a private placement agency. So this led to about 11 years of congressional hearings, testimony, discussions, and the drafting of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which became law in 1978. And what Congress realized as they heard the testimony from many of the same tribal leaders and aunties and uncles and others in the Indian community is that they understood that the best interest of Native children were with their Native families, extended families, and in their communities. That cultural connection, that tribal political connection was critical to their well-being, but also critical to the well-being of the tribe itself. And there was testimony given during that time from some smaller tribes who, after many generations of assimilationist policy, were literally on the brink of going extinct. So this was not an exercise in theory or something. This was very real for many communities. So part of what the Indian Child Welfare Act does, it does three major functions. So one is that recognizes that tribes have inherent jurisdiction and authority. So they have their own tribal courts, they conduct their own proceedings, and they are involved in child welfare matters on their reservations and tribal lands. It also recognized that because of state policies and bias that led to all of these children being removed, that there needed to be some new protections, some new minimum federal standards that would keep Native children from experiencing unfair removals, unnecessary removals, and that to maintain that their tribal government should be involved with them in those. So, and the third thing they did is they provided a little bit of funding, not very much, for off-reservation programs in urban areas and also for tribal governments to do this was some of the very first child welfare funding that was dedicated to tribes that they didn't have to share with states or counties or somebody else. So some of the key requirements are that tribes have to be provided notice when their children are removed, They have to be given an opportunity to intervene in these as a legal party in these proceedings. They have the opportunity to come in as witnesses, expert witnesses, qualified expert witnesses, to testify about whether the way that the state agency or court is looking at this is culturally appropriate and accurate. They also have the opportunity to have placements, preferred placements, with their relatives, other tribal families, in their own child welfare systems and outside of that too. So there are a number of other requirements. I encourage you to look at what the Indian Child Welfare Act does, but it really results in better outcomes for Native children because tribes are there helping, because urban organizations are there helping, because state agencies can't do it on their own. But even as I share this information, you might say, well, this is great. We still have challenges today, and you're going to hear about some of those challenges. And we're going to tell you a little bit about why we think you should be involved too in supporting tribal communities in this work.
Thank you, David. I also realized that I totally forgot to tell y'all where I work. I'm the executive director of the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, and we are a national organization that works with over 55 urban Native organizations in 44 cities. And we work with about a third of the population of all of Indian country are in these cities. I'm going to start with where we're at today. So, you know, I think I would be remiss in having a conversation like this if we didn't really start with what's happening. That was a deep sigh I just took. So, you know, from the panel, and I'm going to start with you, Anita, what kinds of current threats are you seeing in the field that you work in? If you guys could each start with an introduction of yourself, your tribe, where you work, et cetera. And then tell us a little bit about, like, what kind of threats are you seeing? And then are you seeing any direct impact from the downsizing of the federal government right now? And, you know, we'll get into some of the other threats to the social safety net and all of that in a little bit, or you can talk about it right now if you want to. So go ahead, Anita.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. So my name's Anita Fineday, and this has kind of been my life, is working, I'm an attorney by trade, working in the field of Indian child welfare. I was the chief judge for my tribe. I'm White Earth Anishinaabe from Northwest Minnesota, and also Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate. And I worked as the chief judge for my tribe for 14 years, and the majority of my caseload was child welfare cases. And so in that role, I was continuing to remove children from their families, hopefully return them. But after 14 years, I decided there must be something else. So I went to work at Casey Family Programs for a few years and talked about prevention, preservation. Now, right now, I serve on the Better Way Foundation board as a board member, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But to talk about what's happening, I come from Minnesota. And so we have been devastated by the assassinations that took place in our state. And a lot of people knew the state legislator who was a passionate advocate for children. And she was a passionate advocate for immigrants and for undocumented persons. She was a passionate advocate for children. And so we are devastated right now. And so I think we're trying to figure out what do we do next? So I don't think there's much else to say about that. If I tell people I'm from Minnesota, it's like we are just, we're still reeling from what has happened.
Sean?
Pivawana, good morning. It's so humbling to be on this
Can you
panel.
talk a
You guys hear
little-
me okay?
There you go, that's a little better.
All right. So humbling to be on this panel, and I look out in the audience and see so many people out there doing amazing work for Native families. So I'm just really humbled to be up here and be able to talk to you a little bit about my perspective and some of the work that I get to be involved in. So how many of you guys in the audience are Indigenous? Snap your fingers. Man, you guys are beautiful and handsome out here, so it's just really good to be around all of them. And it's good to have this conversation with other Native people, so thank you for being here. I'm Northern Cheyenne. My one-liner for this always is, we're from the tribe that killed Custer, so that's our gift to humanity. Shake my hand and pat me on the back. The blonde narcissist of his time, so we took him out. The issues that I'm seeing in Indian country, and very specifically to families, of course, ICWA, if you've been following ICWA, Brackeen v. Holland went up to the Supreme Court. That threat is still alive. So that threat is still alive. The very concept of and how the federal government frames tribal sovereignty was threatened in that lawsuit. There was a concurrence in that lawsuit to say, hey, you sued the wrong people, you should sue these people. So that's still alive and something that I think we need to be aware of and thoughtful of. I don't look at that as the Brackeen v. Holland as a victory. Actually, very few cases that go up to the Supreme Court in Indian country are victories in the sense that we're always just defending. And so I think Brackeen v. Holland, we defended what we always had. And so much of Indian country is about us defending our land, defending our way of being, our cosmology, our connection. And so there's a concept in Cheyenne, and I'll come back to this in my comment, but this concept of justice in Cheyenne, and I just recently learned this, is esto menes. And what that means is being connected. And so if you think about that concept of justice, is ultimately you being connected with your family around you, your people, your community, your language, your culture, and the land very specifically. So when I think about it, and if I reframe this question, and this makes me kind of think a little bit more expansively, what do I want for my two sons? Like, they're 20 and 16 right now. So what do I want the world to be like for them in 20 years or 40 years or even after I'm gone? What do I want the world to be like for them and their families and their Native families? I think there's two issues that I really think about that a lot of our tribes are kind of dealing with or trying to cope with. And one is membership. I do think that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And so there's tribes that have a concept of blood quantum. I do think those are some issues that we need to be cognizant of. That's the dead center bullseye of what tribal sovereignty is. And so who is us? How do we define us? And so there are kids that are not eligible for ICWA because they don't meet the standard of an Indian child. And that's unfortunate, you know. And so how do we define us and make that inclusive and make that connected to that concept of justice that I was talking about earlier, you know? So how do we frame that? The other issue I feel like, and this is if you're like sitting there, you're a funder and you have your pocketbook out and you're ready to write a check, land back movement. I feel like land. So much of who we are, a lot of indigenous people who we are, I'm not going to say all of us, but probably all of us, is connected to the land. You know, we took care of this land took care of us. We have that relationship with the land, and so that concept of land back and how do we really think about that, and if you're a funder in here and you're thinking about a cause to give to, I do think that's a cause. I think that's definitely connected to reparations, it's connected to restoration of all of us as humanity, and our humanity, you know, so I think that's a wise investment for the future. I do think, and the last thing I'll say is, and I'll come back to Cheyenne actually, and so there's a proverb in Cheyenne, and I'll say it in Cheyenne, I'm trying to speak my language, and so it goes, Hoe e hotwana visio wustanisto, hotomistum evisuav wustanis. And what that means in Cheyenne is that we're all going to have struggles in our life, and that struggle isn't going to define us. It's how we approach it, you know. So we don't always have to be the bad thing that happened to us all our life. And I think collectively, like here, us in this room, I think our future generations, 50 years from now, are going to look at what we did in this fight right now. In 2025, how did we show up? And that's really ultimately what defines us. Did we show up with courage? Did we show up with humanity? Show up with compassion? When we're working with families, I think that's the spirit that we show up with ultimately is what's going to define our work and the work that you're engaged with right now. And so I feel like that proverb speaks a lot of truth to me, especially right now. And so keep fighting the good fight. And it's like I said, it's so humbling to be up on this panel and talking to you guys about these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Well, I'm David Simmons. I'm the Government Affairs and Advocacy Director for the National Indian Child Welfare Association. And I've had the privilege of working in Indian country, 35 years as of today.
Wow.
Just today, so most of my life's work. Some of my, what I understand and recognize about the work that all advocates for Native children hold dear is that this isn't just work that happens in small increments. This isn't like today, tomorrow, 2 years, 3 years. It's generational work, and it's a concept that is in all communities and all places in Indian country. In our organization, we created a document after our board of directors and after the Brackeen case said to us, we need to do something different now. We need to reflect that thinking, that approach to the challenges. And so we created what we call ICWA 2050. And we're just beginning the work. We just we did it the right way, so we went and did listening sessions throughout Indian country. Then we took the information that we had in a draft plan, took it to tribal leaders at the National Congress of American Indians. They reviewed it and they approved it and said, this is good work. We want you to do this. So it's really a generational plan for 25 years, a generation to look at how can we improve tribal and urban capacity to protect Native children and families. How can we create a better environment for the work, doing the work in, with all of our partners, state, federal, private, whomever. And we want to make sure that we're also protecting the Indian Child Welfare Act. We don't take that for granted. So one of my roles in my job is I get to serve as a technical advisor at HHS to 2 different tribal advisory committees. And these tribal advisory committees have tribal leaders from across the country on them, and they're advising the federal government about what the needs are in Indian country and how best to pursue policies, budget, all relationships on this work. And I can tell you that in 35 years of work, I've never faced a greater challenge in that role, and I'm just one small piece of this work. And I'm not trying to be partisan or anything, but what I'm saying is that treaty and trust obligations that you heard about earlier, that's being devolved as we sit here today. And when we start going south on that, we can start to see protections, we can start to see concerns about the old ways coming back, about more children being entered into the foster care system without the protection or the help of assistance of their tribes or urban programs. And so we're in a serious place right now. And we expect the federal government to change, and we're working with that, but we can't do it alone, and we can't do it in just thinking about the federal government either. So we need all of our partners in this.
Thank you, David. And, I would add there that, from what we're hearing, so we work with urban Indian organizations, and, what we're hearing on the ground is that we are beginning to see the erosion of federal funding. And our fear, and I think we share this fear with our relatives on the reservation, is that when ACF took 10 regions to 5 regions, that's enormous. Like the impact of that, we're not even beginning to feel that yet. Because what those ACF staff were actually doing, they were working with our tribes to draft up their 4E and 4B monies, which is their child welfare money, and they were also working with the states to do this. So this huge staff at the Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau specifically, has literally been cut by 3/4, at least half, but probably more at 3/4. And what we don't know yet is what happens to child welfare. What happens when we begin to see a spike in child abuse or neglect, and what happens when states are not funded at the level they should be to be able to address these concerns for Native children, who they have a trust responsibility to look out for on behalf of our tribe. So, there's a lot of unknowns right now, and I know all 3 of these good people up on the stage are working for that. I know a lot of you are actually working on these issues, But I think as Indian country, that is something we really have to keep an eye on, because again, when we start seeing SNAP, Medicaid, LIHEAP, like all of these safety net programs that are being just cut in a very draconian fashion with very little regard for how it's going to impact communities. And again, not just Native communities, this is all Americans. So, you know, for Native communities, I think our tribal leaders will step up and, you know, begin to advocate for trust and treaty obligations. But I think as Native people, this is something we all need to be aware of, and we all need to be talking to our elected officials, our bureaucrats, like just getting the word out and beginning to monitor what kinds of spikes and whatever, whether it's children being seen by the child, you know, having interaction with the child welfare system, if it's families going hungry, those kinds of things. And so, you know, we'll transition to now, like that's all the bad stuff. We know all the bad stuff that's happening. We see it every day in the news. We know what's happening in the world around us. But through all that, we have our tribes and our Indian organizations, our urban Native organizations, you know, part of what your work consists of is ensuring that our children never get to that child welfare system in the first place. And this is where philanthropy can come into play. So philanthropy can fund innovation. Philanthropy, we would never look to philanthropy to make up the hundreds of billions of dollars that were just lost through the federal government. But we do know that there are tribes and urban organizations and other community-based organizations that are doing just phenomenal work to keep our families together and to make sure that we are creating healthy Native families that are able to keep their children. And so with that, you know, I'm gonna start again with you, Anita, to really talk about what are some of those best practices you're seeing out there? Like what's working and what's giving you hope for our community?
So I am here, and I feel I've been remiss. I have not mentioned the Better Way Foundation yet, and I am here on behalf of the Better Way Foundation, and I am here with a message about how things can change. So the Better Way Foundation is a Catholic family foundation, and they it's not a large foundation, but they have gone from funding Catholic schools, and our funding is now 100% funding Native early childhood programs. So we have completely flipped the programs that we fund. So I would say to the funders in the room, we would love to bring you along with us. And I would say the other piece that we directly fund early childhood programs across the country. We also fund CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, I think is what that stands for. But the beauty of CDFIs, there are Native CDFIs, and there's a network of them across the country. And they take money, they loan it out, it's loans, and then they get repaid at a very low interest rate. So the money continues to come back, and it can be reinvested time and time again. So that is one of the strategies that the Better Way Foundation has found to be successful in funding these programs. We don't have enough money to fund all of the early childhood programs in Indian country, but we can build strategies that will support that development. And the other thing that we fund, which might seem a little bit removed, we fund Native language. We understand the importance of Native language in developing strong tribes and tribal families. And we also fund programs that train teachers there are not enough teachers who speak their native language. Early childhood programs have struggled to find native language speakers who want to work in early childhood programs. So we are funding those programs that will train teachers to teach native languages. And so we would love to share with you, especially the funders, we would love to share with you how this has happened. It has happened over 9 years as the foundation has worked to make this transition. So I'm really proud to be on their board, and I think that this is a way forward. It holds great promise. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll be quick about this. And so a lot of my work, I work for Casey Family Programs, a lot of my work is with ICWA courts. 10 years ago, there was 2 ICWA courts in the country. Today, there's 24 ICWA courts in this country. Can you believe that? And if you'd have told me that 10 years ago, I'd have said you're lying. So what we're learning from ICWA courts, and so these are specialty courts, state courts, that are really aiming to get not only compliance with the letter of the law, but really capture the spirit of what this law was written in, the gold standard of child welfare. For all the reasons that David talked about, it's the gold standard, but also more so, it was our aunties, it was our grandmas, it was mothers that went to DC and put on their best clothes and gave testimony about the most horrific thing, their children, most dehumanizing thing that ever happened to them, their children were removed from them. So that was written by lived experience. So really trying to capture that spirit as well and the compliance of the law. What we've learned is quickly 3 things. Number 1, the earlier the better. So if you're going to comply with ICWA, you got to get it right at the very, very beginning. You got to ask the question. So you got to inquire, you got to provide legal notice to the tribe, and the tribe intervenes. There's improved compliance and there's improved outcomes of children going back to their family when those 3 things happen early. Number 2, parents involved in the court case. Of course, if anyone in here has ever been to court, it sucks. And it's a traumatic thing. And so how do we make sure that there's some awareness of that trauma? How do we make sure that courts are engaging directly with the families with cultural humility? Because that end up being indicative of whether the reunification rate, 4 months actually shorter if parents attend court every time, So there's a big emphasis on how do we get parents to court. And then the last thing, and this I think is most relevant to us in this community right here, is culturally relevant services. And so connection to actual services, And so a lot of Native people, about 70% of us live in urban or live off reservations, like I live in Denver, So those services that are within Denver, they actually had a fatherhood program that I joined, I'm referring it, I bet it might as well go through it, So I went through this fatherhood program. It was the most amazing thing, actually. Being around other Native men talking about fatherhood, revolutionary. Coolest thing that I've ever done, actually. So it's a really cool thing. So funding, how do we fund those urban services for Native families that are living off the reservation is a big thing.
Thank you.
I'll try to be quick too. So I know we're one of the things I get to experience in my work besides policy work is I get to go to tribal communities all over the country. Then I get to talk with their child welfare directors, their tribal leaders and others, people who actually are in their systems. And what I see is, and I see this with urban programs too, is that people are indigenizing their work. Right? They're saying we're not just going to accept the kind of mainstream ways of doing child welfare work or working with families, and we're going to come at this from a culturally based way. So the results are amazing. Like what I go to a lot of state conferences too, national conferences, and I go to state conferences and I go, hey, we reduced the foster care rate 4% last year. Yay, and I'm thinking like, well, that's progress. And then I go to, and I speak with some of these tribal programs, these urban programs. We reduced the rate by 40 to 70% of people, kids in care. So where are these kids? They're at home, they're safe, they're staying connected. And that's the kind of work that we want to reward, right? But not every tribe, not every urban program can afford to initiate and create that movement. It is really a movement to do this work. And so we need additional support there. And I also want to mention one other thing is, earlier you heard Sheldon speak a little bit about the kind of continual threats. Well, we have a case in Minnesota right now before the state Supreme Court. And this is another example of how the opponents of the Indian Child Welfare Act, the opponents of tribal sovereignty are not giving up. They're continuing to attack. And so now we've got a case right now. We're expecting a decision, I think, this summer. And of course, we know it's going to be appealed regardless of what the decision is, because the opponents want to get back to the U.S. Supreme Court. They want another bite at the apple. They're not going to be satisfied until they get there. So we have to continually be vigilant. But we have things that are happening that are positive, super positive, and I really encourage you to learn more about those and invest in them too.
Thank you, David. So we're running just a slight bit over, but before we let you guys go, I think, we're at the Native Americans in Philanthropy Conference, and in one or two words, like, what kinds of things can you envision philanthropy being able to support? I mentioned innovation, fatherhood, like, give us a few things that you think philanthropy can support in like 5 words or less.
So we've mentioned some of them, and I'll just reiterate. I mean, I think that we've talked about land bank. We've talked about programs for children, language preservation. I think language preservation is really important. Some of us are losing our fluent speakers, and some of us have very few elders, fluent speakers remaining. So those are two things, but I think also, I think Janine mentioned this, we have not seen the results of the budget cuts yet.
No,
Those have
October 1st.
not filtered down to us yet. Those are coming, and I think that they're going to be shocking when we see 50, 60, 70% of our funding base is going to disappear. So we need to be very innovative, and Native people are the best innovators around. So we're going to be successful, I know.
Good.
Thank you.
Sheldon?
Alvin said this yesterday, and I'll reiterate it because I think it was a smart idea, actually. And so if you're somebody in here that wants to work in Indian country and you're inspired by some of the things that you're learning here and making great connections, get Native people on your board. Hire Native people in senior leadership positions. And so that's step one to have an impact in Indian country. And so that's what you need to do, actually. You can't do it by yourself. And so if you're non-Native and you're thinking about doing this work, that's step one for you. So.
Here's a quick statistic that has been consistent as long as I can remember. Of the child maltreatment that affect most Native children, over 90% of it is neglect. And most of that is based on structural barriers. In other words, people they're living on the margins, they have disadvantages in getting services, but they can take care of their children. They don't have to give their children up to the foster care system. So early intervention, prevention, invest in it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I add?
Yeah.
I would add one more thing. I think Tashina's in the room. Back when I used to work at Casey Family Programs, I funded a few people to come to NAP because a lot of tribal programs, especially those on the reservation, don't have the opportunity to attend convenings like this. And we all know we're in the room to network, right? To meet people who might be funders, but they're doing the work that we're doing or that we want to do, and it's important to be in the room. So I would just encourage people, put Natives on your board, but also fund people from Native programs to attend convenings like this. It really makes a difference.
Absolutely. And I would close by saying again that, philanthropy can fund innovation, and also wherever you're at, find the tribes, find the urban Indian organizations that are in your city. Most philanthropy is based in cities. There's probably an urban Indian organization in that city that your foundation is located in. They will know which tribes you have connections to Indian country, you just don't know it. And you can go to NAP, you can go to any of these national ICWA, there's all kinds of places where you can go to find Native organizations and tribes to fund. And also, don't be afraid to fund tribes. You can fund tribes. So, there are all kinds of ways that philanthropy can support Native Indian country. And we would just say that, our culture is based in our families. And so funding those programs, those tribes, those urban organizations that are working towards keeping our families together in whatever capacity, early childhood, language, fatherhood, you name it. There's a whole host of things you can fund out there to help keep Native families together and keep them out of the system in the first place. Like David said, poverty is the number one cause of our children entering the child welfare system. So how can we begin to, tap away at these programs that help our families stay out of poverty? And we wish we had time for questions and answers, but we don't. So we will end it here. And thank you all for coming, and give a hand to these folks.
Good job. Good job. Yep, thank you, Janine.
Yeah.